headliner. I'm a headliner.
Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Your boy Kyle back with the Fantasy Headliners, my favorite time of the week. We're going to be talking about some tight ends, the football kind, for a bye-mageddon here in week 14. We've got six teams on a bye this week. Now, the good news is that the tight end position, based on the teams that are on a bye, are not really that affected. But we're coming off a week in which the best tight ends sucked. The worst tight ends actually did good. Guys who hadn't shown up for weeks finally showed up, and we don't know what to make of the position. There are a couple of guys showing up in this show that maybe we haven't started in a while, and you're definitely going to need to check back on Thursday for the rankings because there's a couple of more guys that are up in the air as well. But hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, and let's hop right into it, starting with our Thursday night matchup. Las Vegas and the LA Rams. And leaving Foster Moreau, he left shortly for the concussion protocol. I kind of do air quotes because I don't know if he was actually ever in a protocol or just checked or what it ended up being. But he did leave shortly after hit to the head, ended up coming back, and he's still the number 2 target in Las Vegas right now. He's kind of the number 2 guy currently. I would say he's a little bit safer than Matt Collins even right now. My concern going up against the LA Rams is that they're just going to run the ball with Jacobs, who's on absolute fire right now, and we're not going to get much in the passing game outside of Devontae Adams. If that happens, then I don't know if Foster Moreau ends up hitting 8-10 fantasy points. However, given the potential upside here in a matchup going up against the LA Rams who have been banged up on defense and can't really do anything offensively, I'm still going to go ahead and roll with him to potentially score a touchdown and at least see enough production without a touchdown. That kind of 8 fantasy points is that sweet spot that I'm looking for this week. Tyler Higbee, we're going to have to put him as a start. Again, bye-mageddon. We've got so many teams on a bye this week, and Tyler Higbee is still top 6 at the tight end position in targets per game. Yes, the production sucks. Yes, he hasn't done anything in a while. This is a good matchup. Going up against Las Vegas allows the 6th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. I'm going to be willing to risk it this week depending on what your options are. There's not many tight ends that you can throw in your lineup this week that A, face a team that gives up the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends, and B, gets the 6th most fantasy targets, or excuse me, gets the 5th most targets at the position. Those tight ends just aren't laying around right now. So yes, it's risky because we haven't seen much from Higbee. He's also been banged up recently as well. Given the matchup, given the targets, if you're looking for someone to help you out, I may risk it with Higbee. New York Jets, Buffalo Bills, 2 extremely disappointing tight ends. The first one, Tyler Conklin, disappointing because he started the year off so well and hasn't really done anything since then. Buffalo allows the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. And Tyler Conklin had 7 targets last game, which was really good. And he was a guy that I looked at as a potential start last week and even said the targets could be there. However, he was only able to haul in 2 of those 7 targets, so he didn't do anything with them. But it's his most targets in 4 weeks, and it is 2nd most targets since week 3. Is that going to continue? I would really hope so, but this is a tougher matchup. Now, you might be saying, Kyle, well, you just talked about targets a minute ago with Higbee, and you gave him the start, but now you're talking about targets with Conklin, you're not giving him the start. It's the matchups. It's a lot different when you're taking a look at Buffalo, who allows the 5th fewest, and you're taking a look at Las Vegas going up against the Rams that allow the 6th most. That's the tipping point for me and why Conklin is going to be a sit this week. For Dawson Knox, he's disappointing because a lot of fantasy owners drafted him as your starting tight end this year. And if you would have bought our draft guide, you wouldn't have, but that's a story for a different day. But again, even with the elbow injury to Josh Allen, and we've talked about that quite a bit, and I will say this past week, Josh Allen looked a whole lot better. He looked a whole lot better. The difference between him from Thanksgiving Day against Detroit to this past Thursday against New England was night and day. He looks like a guy that is getting healthy finally, which is good to see for fantasy owners, for the Buffalo Bills, for everybody involved, including Josh Allen. But even with the elbow injury, when he wasn't able to go down the field as consistently as you would have liked, Dawson Knox still wasn't getting targets. So now that he's getting healthier, and yes, this is going to be a tougher matchup for the wide receivers, I'm still going to be out on Dawson Knox. He's way too risky these days. The Battle of Ohio, Cincinnati and Cleveland. And for Cleveland, David Njoku ended up kind of being a surprise inactive last week. I mean, he came back the week prior, scored a touchdown. We know he's been banged up. Seemed like he was trending in the right direction to end up getting healthy. And then all of a sudden, nope. See you later, David. You're going to be out this week. Now, here's my issue. And we talked about this in the What Just Happened video that we post on Mondays, kind of recapping our starts and sits and what happened over the weekend. Deshaun Watson doesn't look good. It's been over 800 days since he had played in an NFL regular season game, so it makes sense that there was some rust. But Jake brought up an excellent point, that this looks like a team that is trying to now all of a sudden force it and say, now we have to essentially say, we did all of this to get Deshaun Watson on the field. Now we have to prove it was worth it. And I feel like that changes the game plan, and it takes away from what makes Cleveland good, which is disappointing because I feel like Kevin Stefanski is a smarter dude than that. If we can see it, I feel like he would be able to. So if David Njoku plays, he's a start for me. He's just been way too good this season. Now, he's going to be a risky start based on what we've seen from Deshaun Watson, but David Njoku seems like the perfect guy to help Deshaun Watson kind of get headed in the right direction. However, if he doesn't play, of course he's going to be a sit. But it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. We don't know if he's going to make it back this week. It's a big if at this point. And even if he does, are we going to get enough consistency from Deshaun Watson to really get that upside that we would need from him? Now, when we talk about Cincinnati, there's not really even much to talk about here. As of right now, it does appear that Hayden Hurst is going to be doubtful for week 14 and wouldn't even play, but the Browns allow the 7th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So even if Hurst were to play, I don't know if I'm trusting Hayden Hurst anyway. But with him not playing, if that happens, well, I'm not willing to trust CJ, who's your mama, or really anybody else at the tight end position. Houston and Dallas. Houston's going to have a tough matchup. Dallas obviously coming off just a crazy performance against Indianapolis. Oh, they also allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. Jordan Akins is getting targets. Brevin Jordan is getting targets. Both of them are seeing about equal production. Given the tough matchup and equal production, we're not investing in either one of them. Dalton Schultz, it was a disappointing game. If you would have told me, Kyle, Dallas is going to put up 50 points on the Indianapolis Colts, where would you have Dalton Schultz ranked? He would have been my tight end 4, tight end 3 easy. I wouldn't have even double thought it. No, dude wasn't even a top 12 tight end. That's how poor his performance was, which is really crazy. But he still had 6 targets. He still had 6 targets in this game. And he had, in the previous 3 games, 3 touchdowns. So the production has been there. The targets have been there. He's still one of Dak's favorite guys. The one thing to keep an eye on moving forward, though, Odell Beckham Jr. Does he sign with Dallas? And if he does it hurt or help Dalton Schultz? Minnesota at Detroit. TJ Hawkinson, revenge game time. And even being a Lions fan, and one that is hopeful that they will play well against Minnesota. Even if they don't beat Minnesota this week, even if they play well against them, I'm pretty confident TJ Hawkinson's going to have himself a day. I think the Vikings are going to make sure of it. Just like we saw with like A.J. Brown against Tennessee last week and DJ Chark against Jacksonville as well. I think TJ Hawkinson gets his revenge this week. Detroit is allowing the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. It's a great matchup for TJ Hawkinson. He's been getting tons of targets since he's went over to Minnesota. I 100% believe that he is going to be a guy that will have a big game. The last time Detroit and Minnesota played, Detroit did everything they could to take away Justin Jefferson. And guess what? They did. They limited him to barely anything that day. Irv Smith Jr. did have a touchdown, though. I would expect the same thing from TJ Hawkinson. And as far as it goes on the other side of the ball, there's really nothing to see in Detroit. They've got 3 tight ends that they're rotating right now. None of them really doing anything fantasy viable-wise, so we'll leave them out of the picture. Eagles and Giants, there's really not much to see here. If Dallas Goedert was playing this week, hey, this would be a smash start for Goddard. We'd be feeling good about this matchup going up against the New York Giants in the top 12 of most fantasy points allowed to tight ends. But for Jack Stoll, that's a no-go. We're not interested in that. Daniel Bellinger is a guy I really want to keep an eye on. Nice return from injury, and he was a guy that I was getting higher on before he had the eye injury to his socket. 5 targets last week, caught all 5 for 24 yards. Doesn't sound great, but I think it's a good return after having your eye smashed into your head, right? I think that's a fine return. So the Eagles allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. However, this isn't really the spot I want for Bellinger. I am on board with getting him fired up the rest of the season. Again, just with all the injuries that they've had at the wide receiver position, with how ineffective they've been at that point, outside of really Darius Slayton, Bellinger has a really nice opportunity to carve out the number 2 role, especially considering the fact that we haven't seen the type of targets go to Saquon Barkley that we have in the past. Bellinger's definitely a guy that moving forward, especially in the playoffs, we're keeping an eye on him. No pun intended. Baltimore and Pittsburgh is going to bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week. If you're still doing any Christmas shopping out there, head over to manscaped.com. When you check out, use code word headliners. You're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. Manscaped.com, code word headliners. I expect a big bounce back for Mark Andrews this week, and I swear to God, if I get the same question I got last year, I'm going to wag my finger at all of you. I'm going to be disappointed, because if you remember correctly, last year when Lamar Jackson went down with his injury, we got the question over and over and over. Are we still starting Mark Andrews? I'm scared to start Mark Andrews. I'm worried about Mark Andrews' production. It was the same thing over and over with Tyler Huntley taking over. And I said, guys, it doesn't matter. We're going to stick with Tyler. We're going to stick with Mark Andrews, even with Tyler Huntley, because Mark Andrews is going to be his target. He's going to be his main target. Lo and behold, Tyler Huntley played in week 11, and then he came back a couple of weeks later after Lamar re-injured himself. And during that time, Mark Andrews was the tight end 1. We are not moving off Mark Andrews, everybody. If you have Mark Andrews and you're even worried a little bit, smack it out of yourself, because we're rolling with Mark Andrews. We've already seen him do it with Tyler Huntley. We're putting him back out there. The Pat Freiermuth really looking good again. The targets have dropped a little bit, but even with that being said, he still showed that big playability last week, and that was good to see. Yeah, I didn't get as many targets as we would like, as many receptions as we'd like, but the big plays were there because he had over 80 yards. That's what I love to see. And listen, he's the number 1 target on this team. We're seeing inconsistency from George Pickens. Deontay Johnson hasn't done anything this year. Najee Harris isn't getting a ton of targets. If there's one guy that we can trust in Pittsburgh, it's Pat Freiermuth. And honestly, his consistency right now makes him a top 4 or 5 tight end every week. Jacksonville and Tennessee and Evan Ingram. Listen, Evan, I might be one of your biggest supporters. I think you're a darn good football player. And I bought back into you this season after you started to roll a little bit. And I was like, all right, this is the Evan Ingram. And then now you disappeared again. So I said, all right, I guess we got to be off Evan Ingram. And then all of a sudden you come back and you score a touchdown. Now to my, listen, let's take just a step back. Last week, to my credit, I did say I wouldn't be surprised if Evan Ingram scored a touchdown, right? And guess what? He did. So that happened last week. But for this week, I got to list him as a start again. I mean, he burned me last week. The targets are slightly better. This is a decent matchup. The thing that I'm kind of leaning towards with Evan Ingram this week is Zay Jones had multiple drops last week. They weren't great. I mean, they weren't like tough drops either. They were drops that he should have had. And they were drops that could have kept the play going, could have kept the drive going. And I think Trevor Lawrence is going to look to Evan Ingram maybe a little bit more this week and try to utilize him a little bit more, knowing he found the touchdown, the touchdown last week. Now, if we look on the other side for Tennessee, Austin Hooper is definitely off the board. But there's some interest here with my man Chigiooko. That's what I'm calling him. He hasn't reached enough upside as of yet. But over the past few weeks, we're seeing some decent yards. He's been over 60 a couple of times, been right around that 35 mark, went over 60 last week. I mean, he's definitely looks like he's starting to take a little bit of a bigger role in this offense. And I don't think that's bad whatsoever. I need to see it a little bit more. Now, missing Treylon Burks, maybe that changes things. So I don't know if it necessarily helps him that much, because then they can, afford to look at them a little bit more. When you've got a guy like that's formerly of Tennessee. When you got a guy like Treylon Burks that can stretch the field, it's going to allow some room for the tight end to roam in the middle of the field. And that's what I would be hoping for. So if Treylon Burks is back this week, another 50, 60 yards from Chiggy, I wouldn't doubt it. All right. but it's not really enough yet for us to get super excited. However, check back on the rankings because there's a really good chance that this guy could still find himself inside the top 18. Kansas City and Denver, and honestly, Travis Kelce, you could have 8 bad games in a row, and I still would not even think twice to put you in my lineup. So who cares about last week's bad week? He's back in there for you, Kelce owners, and I think we're going to see a big bounce back and a big blow-up game from him from this week. Greg Dulcich. Now, part of me sitting Dulcich this week after starting him for each of the several weeks before and then finally having him be fantasy viable again last week when sitting him, part of Dulcich this week starting hinges on Courtland Sutton because Jerry Jeudy was back this week and Courtland Sutton was playing as well, but then Courtland Sutton went down in that game and then all of a sudden Dulcich started to see more targets again. So what are we going to do with Courtland Sutton potentially being in or out? That is one thing, again, where you're going to have to check back later in the week. He's a sit for me as of right now, but if Sutton ends up missing, there's a good chance I move Dulcich to being a start. Carolina and Seattle, and the Seahawks may allow the second most fantasy points to tight end, but we're still not going to risk it with Tommy or Trimble. Why? Well, I mean, starting these guys at tight end is basically like asking your wife for a little nookie, right? You do it over and over, and every single time throughout the week, she has a headache. She's not into it. There's one reason or another. And then that one night where it's finally like, yeah, we're getting lucky tonight, you fall asleep early in the recliner. It's just disappointing, right? Yeah, it happens. We're not starting either of these guys. For Fant and Dissly, I would love to start Noah Fant because I like him and because he does have good games every once in a while, but he's way too inconsistent. He'll have a fantasy viable performance and then he'll disappear for a couple of weeks. It's just way too hard to predict when exactly Fant is going to be a guy that you can rely on. Tampa Bay, San Francisco, Cade Otton coming off a big week last week, and that's great and all. But that's New Orleans, and this is the San Francisco 49ers, and the 49ers do allow the third fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and they're a little bit more sound on defense, if you ask me. I'm not going to risk it in this matchup. Again, you've got Julio, you've got Mike Evans, you've got it's just one of the you've got Chris Godwin. I'm just not going to risk throwing him out there. Rachaad White still seeing some receptions in the game as well. And Otton was very close to having 2 touchdowns, and I get that, but there just isn't enough for me to roll back to him this week. George Kittle, however, with Tampa Bay allowing the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends, we got Mr. Irrelevant Purdy taking over, and I think Purdy's going to be a guy that is going to look to George Kittle. He's going to look to Deebo Samuel. He's going to look to CMC. I do think Brandon Ayuk will be affected with this a little bit. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but really George Kittle, I do think he's a fantastic start this week. Miami and the LA Chargers, Waddle's injury being up in the air could end up changing this, and this is something that I will check back on later in the week to see if he makes it into the top 18, because if there's no Jalen Waddle going up against the Chargers, a decent matchup for tight ends, I could see myself putting Gesicki inside the top 18 and saying, hey, if you really don't have anybody and you need a risky start with touchdown upside, it would be Mike Gesicki for me, but we'll talk about that later in the week. Gerald Everett, Miami allows the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. I will risk it again with Gerald Everett. I'm going to fire him back up. Even though last week was his first fantasy relevant week since week 4, I will still go back to it this week knowing how good the matchup could end up being for him. Now, if Mike Williams end up clearing and does play this week, then maybe we need to revisit that in the rankings. New England and Arizona, and I am firing up Hunter Henry this week. I'm doing it. It feels so good. I absolutely love it. The Cardinals allow the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. They've been banged up at wide receiver. They need somebody to step up. Give me Hunter Henry or give me death. Actually, let me rephrase that. Give me Hunter Henry or just give me a slap on the wrist or something, because it's still risky to do this. If you start Hunter Henry, you are assuming all risk. In fact, if you start Hunter Henry this week, let me know. I'm going to email you a waiver that go ahead and waives us of any issues that you may get from starting Hunter Henry. That's how risky it is. But given the matchup, I'm absolutely going to Hunter Henry this week. I think he makes an impact. And then Trey McBride, well, I mean, he's basically been irrelevant since Ertz's injury, so there's nothing to talk about there. But there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the tight ends for week 14. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below if you've got any questions. I'm going to get out of here so I can start diving in to wide receivers. Peace out, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.